Jake Morrison sat in the back row of the Galactic Council chamber and watched 47 different alien species argue about the same problem they had been fighting over for months. The huge room floated in space around a dead star that gave off strange blue light, and the walls were made of some kind of crystal that let everyone see the stars outside. Each species had their own section with special chairs or platforms that fit their bodies. The Zephyrians looked like walking diamonds and made musical sounds when they talked. The nebulae were like floating clouds of gas that changed colors when they got excited. The ancient Korthari had bodies that seemed to fade in and out of reality. Ambassador Lisa Carter led the human group, but today she had asked Jake to watch and learn. Humans had only been part of the council for 50 years, which made them babies, compared to species that had been here for thousands of years. Most aliens still saw humans as the new kids who should stay quiet and listen to their elders. The big fight today was about the Draknari Empire attacking Ilthani worlds over some mining rights in a place called the Andromeda Sector. Elder Zethvar of the Korthari spoke in a voice that sounded like wind chimes, talking about being careful and thinking things through slowly. His people had quantum brains that could see many possible futures at once, so they never liked to rush into anything. General Vorthak of the Draknari was the complete opposite. He looked like a 7-foot-tall lizard covered in black armor, and when he got angry, which was most of the time, smoke came out of his nose. He slammed his clawed fist on his speaking platform and roared that the Ilthani were cowards who deserved to be crushed. His translator made his words sound even more threatening than they probably were in his own language. The Ilthani delegate was a thin, pale creature with 4 arms who kept all of them folded in a peaceful gesture. Her name was something Jake could not pronounce, but she spoke in a soft voice about how her people just wanted to live in peace and share the resources of space with everyone. Her large, dark eyes looked sad every time Vorthak spoke about destroying her worlds. Jake watched as other species began to choose sides. The ethereal collective, who were beings made of pure energy, started glowing brighter, which meant they were getting upset. The Aquatic Federation, who needed special water tanks to survive in the chamber, began making bubbling sounds that their translator said were curse words. Even the normally calm tree people from the forest worlds were rustling, their branch-like arms in agitation. What worried Jake the most was how the older species seemed completely unable to find a solution. They had been running the galaxy for 3,000 years, but when faced with a simple territorial dispute, all they could do was argue and take sides. The Zephyrians wanted to form a committee to study the problem for the next 50 years. The Draknari wanted immediate war. The Korthari wanted to meditate on all possible outcomes until the perfect solution revealed itself. Nobody was talking about the real victims in this fight. Jake had seen the reports that Ambassador Carter shared with him. Millions of civilians were caught between the Draknari war fleets and the Ilthani defense forces. Refugee ships were fleeing the combat zones with nowhere safe to go. Children were dying while the council debated the finer points of territorial law. The session went on for 6 hours without any progress. Species that had been allies for centuries were now glaring at each other across the chamber. Trade agreements were being canceled. Military alliances were being questioned. Jake could see the entire galactic civilization starting to crack apart over one stupid dispute about who owned some rocks in space. When Elder Zethvar finally called for a recess, the aliens filed out of the chamber in small groups, whispering in their own languages. Jake noticed that none of the groups included members from other species. The unity that had held the galaxy together for so long was disappearing before his eyes. As he walked back to the human quarters, Jake passed by other conversations in the corridors. His universal translator picked up fragments from different languages, but the meaning was always the same. Fear, anger, and uncertainty were spreading through the station like a disease. The Galactic Council, which had prevented major wars for 3 millennia, was falling apart because nobody could agree on how to stop 2 species from fighting. That night, Jake lay in his small quarters and stared out at the stars, wondering if humanity had joined the Galactic Council just in time to watch it destroy itself. 3 weeks after the failed council session, the galaxy was falling apart. Captain Amy Brooks stood on the bridge of the UNS Determination and watched refugee ships stream past her position near Sanctuary Station. The Draknari had launched full attacks on 12 Ilthani colony worlds, claiming that ancient treaties gave them the right to those systems. The Ilthani were fighting back, but their peaceful society was not built for war. Amy had been a ship captain for 15 years, but she had never seen anything like this. Her sensors showed Draknari battleships hunting down civilian transports, while Ilthani defense fleets tried desperately to protect evacuation routes. The worst part was that both sides were right according to different interpretations of galactic law. The Draknari had old territorial claims that predated the current treaties. The Ilthani had legal settlements that had been approved by the Council itself. Dr. Ryan Clark ran the medical bay on the Determination, and he had not slept in 3 days. Wounded refugees from both sides were arriving at Sanctuary Station faster than the medical teams could treat them. Ryan worked alongside alien doctors he had never met before, using equipment he barely understood, trying to save lives that most of the galaxy seemed ready to throw away. The injured Draknari soldiers were the hardest cases for Ryan to handle, not because of their wounds, but because of their attitudes. They had been taught from birth that showing weakness was shameful, so they refused pain medication and tried to fight the medical staff even while dying. Ryan had to learn how to treat patients who saw accepting help as a form of surrender. Sucker. Ilthani refugees were easier to work with but harder to watch. Whole families had been separated during the evacuations. Children cried for parents who might be dead or trapped on occupied worlds. The Ilthani healed faster than humans, but their emotional wounds seemed to cut much deeper. Ryan found himself learning words in their language just to comfort scared children. Back on the council station, Jake Morrison was dealing with a different kind of chaos. Ambassador Carter had caught some kind of alien virus that affected her nervous system, leaving Jake as the temporary head of the human delegation. Every day brought new requests from different species asking humans to mediate their disputes or take sides in the growing conflict. Elder Zara Veltar of the Zephyrians visited Jake in his office, her crystalline body pulsing with nervous energy. She spoke in mathematical concepts that the translator had trouble converting into human language, but her meaning was clear. The Zephyrians were terrified that the war would spread to their trade routes and destroy the economic systems they had spent centuries building. The nebulae sent a delegation of floating gas clouds that communicated through color changes and chemical signals. They wanted humans to understand that their hive mind was fracturing under the stress of the conflict. Parts of their collective consciousness were choosing different sides, which was causing them actual physical pain. Even species that were not directly involved in the fighting were being forced to choose sides. The tree people were cutting off food supplies to worlds that supported the Draknari. The Aquatic Federation was refusing to share water purification technology with Ilthani supporters. Ancient alliances were crumbling as every species looked out for their own interests. Jake spent his days in endless meetings with alien diplomats who all wanted the same thing from humanity, but none of them could explain exactly what that was. They seemed to think that humans had some special ability to solve problems that had defeated the galaxy's wisest minds. Jake was not sure if this was a compliment or a burden that humans were not ready to carry. The breaking point came when Amy received a distress call from a refugee convoy that was under attack near human space. The convoy included both Ilthani families and Draknari civilians who had refused to support the war. Draknari military ships were attacking the convoy, while Ilthani escorts tried to defend it. Lieutenant Ben Parker, Amy's tactical officer, showed her the sensor readings with a grim expression. The convoy would be destroyed within an hour unless someone intervened. The problem was that any military action could be seen as humans taking sides in the conflict. If Amy helped the convoy, the Draknari might declare war on humanity. If she did nothing, thousands of innocent people would die. Amy stood on her bridge and watched the battle unfold on her main screen. Draknari warships fired on transport vessels, full of families. Ilthani fighters sacrificed themselves to give the refugees more time to escape. In the middle of the chaos, she could see human-built medical ships that had been donated to help refugees, now being used as shields by the very people the convoy was trying to save. The decision that Amy made in that moment would change the course of galactic history. She ordered the Determination to enter the combat zone, not to attack either side, but to position her ship between the warring fleets and the refugee transports. Her crew created a protective corridor that allowed the civilian ships to escape to safety. When the smoke cleared, Amy had saved over 3,000 lives without firing a single shot. She had also made humanity a target for every military force in the galaxy. As news of her actions spread through the Council networks, species that had been neutral in the conflict suddenly found themselves forced to decide what they thought about human interference in galactic affairs. The Emergency Council session was the largest gathering in galactic history. Every species had sent their most important leaders to debate what humans had done during the refugee convoy rescue. Jake Morrison found himself sitting in the main speaker's chair because Ambassador Carter was still too sick to attend. He had never felt so small as when he looked out at hundreds of alien delegates who were all staring at him. General Vorthak of the Draknari was the first to speak, and his anger made the air in the chamber feel hot. He accused humans of violating every neutrality agreement in galactic law by interfering in a sovereign military operation. His clawed hands gestured wildly as he described how human actions had allowed enemy combatants to escape justice. The translator made his roars sound even more frightening than they were in his native language. The Ilthani delegate spoke next, her forearms folded in a gesture of deep gratitude. She praised Captain Brooks and her crew for showing the kind of courage that had become rare in the galaxy. Her soft voice carried across the chamber as she described families that were alive today because humans had chosen to act when others chose to watch. Elder Zara Veltar of the Zephyrians stood on her crystal platform and spoke in mathematical equations that showed the probable outcomes of human intervention. Her analysis proved that Amy's actions had actually reduced the total amount of violence in the region by creating safe evacuation routes for civilians. The numbers were beautiful in their precision, but they also showed how the conflict was spreading beyond its original boundaries. The ethereal collective glowed brighter as their energy beings debated among themselves at the speed of light. When they finally spoke through their translation device, their message was simple but troubling. They accused humans of bringing chaos into a system that had maintained order for 3,000 years. According to their logic, saving lives was less important than preserving the stability that kept the galaxy from complete war. Jake listened to hours of debate without understanding how aliens could be so intelligent about some things and so blind about others. They argued about laws and treaties and territorial rights, but none of them talked about the families that Amy had saved. They worried about setting precedents and maintaining authority, but they ignored the fact that their authority had failed to prevent the crisis in the first place. When Elder Zethvar of the Korthari asked Jake to explain human actions, he found himself thinking about a conversation he had with Captain Brooks after her ship arrived at the council station. She had been tired and stressed, but her eyes were clear when she told him about watching the battle unfold on her main screen. Jake stood up in the speaker's area and looked out at all the alien faces, sensors, and energy patterns that were focused on him. He began by talking about human history, which most aliens knew very little about. He told them about the wars that humans had fought against each other for thousands of years. He described the mistakes his species had made when they put politics above people and laws above lives. The chamber grew quiet as Jake explained how humans had learned that survival was not about being the strongest or the smartest, but about working together to protect those who could not protect themselves. He talked about the human concept of paying it forward, which meant helping others without expecting anything in return because someone had helped you when you needed it. Dr. Lydia Foster had arrived with Captain Brooks, and Jake called her forward to share her research on interspecies psychology. She had spent years studying how different alien cultures approached moral decisions, and her findings surprised even her. Species that practiced cooperation and mutual aid had higher survival rates when facing extinction-level threats. The data showed that compassion was not just a nice idea, but a practical strategy for long-term success. Captain Brooks herself spoke about the tactical situation during the convoy rescue. She explained how her decision to create a protective corridor had actually benefited everyone involved, including the Draknari forces who no longer had to worry about accidentally killing their own civilians. Her military analysis showed that helping refugees was not just morally right, but strategically smart. The aliens in the chamber began to buzz with conversation as they processed this new information. The Korthari quantum consciousness started, running probability calculations on scenarios where compassion-based decisions led to better outcomes. The Zephyrians created mathematical models that showed how helping others could create positive feedback loops in galactic civilization. Even some of the Draknari delegates seemed interested in the human perspective, though they tried to hide their curiosity behind stern expressions. Jake noticed that younger Draknari officers were taking notes while their elders maintained angry poses. As the session continued, Jake realized that something fundamental was changing in the chamber. For the first time in galactic history, species were debating not just what was legal or profitable, but what was right. The word that kept appearing in the translation devices was one that many aliens had never considered as a basis for government: policy. The word was compassion, and it was spreading through the chamber like a new form of energy that none of their sensors could measure but all of their hearts could feel. The council chamber fell completely silent when Jake finished speaking about compassion. In that moment of quiet, something extraordinary happened. A young Ilthani aide whispered the word to her supervisor in her own language, and the universal translators picked it up and spread it through the chamber. Every species heard the concept in their own way, but somehow the meaning stayed the same across all the different alien minds. Elder Zethvar of the Korthari was the first to break the silence. His quantum consciousness had been processing the idea of compassion through millions of possible timelines, and what he found amazed him. He spoke in his wind chime voice about how this human concept transcended the logical frameworks that had guided galactic civilization for millennia. The idea of taking action based on the inherent value of life itself, rather than on political or economic gain, was completely foreign to traditional council thinking. General Vorthak slammed his armored fist on his platform and roared his objection. To him, compassion was just another word for weakness, and weakness had no place in the harsh realities of governing a galaxy. He spoke about natural law and survival of the fittest, arguing that the strong were meant to rule while the weak were, meant to serve or die. His translator made his words sound like the roar of an ancient predator defending its territory. But something had changed in the chamber, and even Vorthak could feel it. Other Draknari delegates were not nodding in agreement as they usually did when their general spoke. Some of them were looking at the human delegation with curiosity rather than contempt. A few younger Draknari officers were actually taking notes on what Jake had said. Dr. Lydia Foster stepped forward with Jake's permission and presented research that shocked everyone in the chamber. She had spent years studying the psychology of different alien species, and her data showed clear patterns that none of them had noticed before. Civilizations that based their decisions on compassion and cooperation had significantly higher survival rates when facing existential threats. They were more innovative, more adaptable, and more resistant to the kind of internal conflicts that destroyed empires. Captain Brooks was called forward to share her tactical analysis of the refugee convoy rescue. She showed detailed sensor logs that proved how her compassion-based decision had led to the optimal outcome for all parties involved. Even the Draknari forces had benefited from her actions because they no longer had to worry about accidentally killing their own civilians or dealing with the political backlash from civilian casualties. The Zephyrians, with their love of mathematical precision, began running complex calculations on what galactic civilization might look like if compassion became a governing principle. Their crystal bodies pulsed with excitement as the equations revealed stable configurations that had never been achieved through traditional power politics. Elder Zara Veltar announced that their preliminary models showed a 73% increase in overall galactic stability if compassion-based policies were implemented. The Nebulae collective consciousness was struggling with the concept because their hive mind made individual compassion difficult to understand. But their chemist-philosophers began creating new molecular combinations that represented the idea of caring for beings outside their own collective. The colors that swirled through their gaseous forms started showing patterns that their translators said meant wonder and hope. Even the ancient tree people, who rarely spoke in council sessions, rustled their branch-like arms and spoke about how compassion was the foundation of forest ecosystems. In their slow, deep voices, they explained how trees that helped other trees during droughts or insect attacks created stronger forests that could survive disasters that killed individual trees standing alone. As the debate continued, Jake watched something incredible happen. Species that had been enemies for centuries began talking to each other about shared problems. The rigid divisions between military and peaceful species started to blur as everyone realized that compassion was not about being weak, but about being strong enough to help others even when it cost you something. A young Draknari officer named Kethvar asked permission to speak, which shocked everyone because junior officers never addressed the full council. He told the chamber about his experiences treating wounded Draknari soldiers who had been helped by human medical teams. These soldiers had returned to their units with stories about enemies who healed their wounds and asked for nothing in return. The officer's words carried weight because he was speaking from personal experience rather than political theory. The Aquatic Federation sent bubbles of different colors through their water tanks to create a message that their translators said meant they wanted to try the human approach to conflict resolution. The ethereal collective dimmed their energy forms to show they were considering the implications of compassion-based governance. Even some of the smaller species that rarely spoke in council sessions began asking questions about how they could implement compassionate policies in their own territories. By the end of the session, the chamber was buzzing with conversations that would have been impossible just hours before. Species were not just debating the refugee convoy incident anymore. They were discussing fundamental changes to how galactic civilization could work. The word compassion had become more than just a translation problem. It had become a new way of thinking that was spreading through the chamber like a virus of hope. Jake sat back in his chair and realized that humans had not just defended their actions. They had accidentally started a revolution that could change the galaxy forever. Not everyone was happy about the human idea of compassion. General Vorthak stormed out of the council chamber, followed by delegates from 6 militaristic species who refused to accept what they saw as dangerous weakness. Within days, they formed something called the Strength Coalition and announced their intention to solve the galaxy's problems through traditional methods of military conquest and territorial expansion. The coalition included the Draknari Empire, the warrior clans of Zerion, the Predator States, and several smaller species that had built their entire cultures around the idea that might makes right. They set up their own command center on a military station in disputed space and began preparing for what they called the final solution to galactic weakness. At the same time, a second group was forming around the human concept of compassion. The Ilthani were the first to formally join what became known as the Compassion Alliance, followed quickly by the Tree People and several peaceful trading species. The Korthari quantum consciousness had calculated potential futures where compassion-based policies prevented larger conflicts, and they decided to commit their ancient wisdom to the experiment. Even some progressive Zephyrian city-states broke away from their main crystalline government to join the alliance. Their mathematical models showed that cooperation created exponentially better outcomes than competition in most scenarios. Elder Zara Veltar herself defied her own people's conservative leadership to support the human approach. Jake found himself in a position he had never wanted or expected. The council appointed him as the first Compassion Coordinator, a newly created role that gave him authority to implement humanitarian policies across Alliance space. It was terrifying to think that a human diplomat who had joined the galactic community just 50 years ago was now responsible for protecting billions of alien lives. Working with Captain Brooks, Dr. Clark, and a diverse team of alien specialists, Jake began establishing new protocols for conflict resolution. Instead of sending battle fleets when disputes arose, the Alliance would send medical ships, construction crews, and humanitarian aid workers. The idea was to solve problems by helping everyone involved, rather than by defeating one side or the other. The real test came when Draknari forces attacked a mixed-species colony in the buffer zone between Alliance and Coalition territory. The A colony included families from 12 different species who had been living together peacefully for over a century. The Draknari claimed ancient territorial rights to the system and demanded that all non-Draknari residents evacuate immediately. The Strength Coalition expected the Alliance to respond with military force, which would justify a full-scale war between the two factions. Coalition leaders had spent weeks preparing for glorious battles that would prove once and for all that strength was the only language the universe understood. Jake made a decision that surprised everyone, including his own allies. Instead of sending warships to defend the colony, he dispatched medical vessels, engineering ships, and relief supplies to help everyone affected by the attack. When Draknari military forces arrived expecting to fight Alliance battle fleets, they found something completely different. Human doctors were treating wounded Draknari soldiers alongside their intended victims. Zephyrian engineers were rebuilding destroyed Draknari settlements using crystalline technology that made the structures stronger than before. Ilthani agricultural specialists were helping Draknari farmers whose crops had been damaged in the fighting. The confusion in Draknari ranks was immediate and complete. Soldiers who had come prepared for glorious combat found themselves face-to-face with enemies who insisted on treating them as fellow beings deserving of care and respect. Young Draknari warriors who had been raised on stories of heroic battles against inferior species instead found themselves accepting medical treatment from the very aliens they were supposed to be conquering. Dr. Ryan Clark led the medical response team and found himself working alongside Draknari military medics who had never seen alien healing techniques before. The Draknari approach to medicine was based on survival of the fittest, which meant that seriously wounded soldiers were often left to die if their injuries were too severe. Ryan showed them how human medicine focused on saving every life possible, regardless of the cost or difficulty. The breakthrough came when a young Draknari soldier named Vortak was critically injured in an equipment malfunction during the occupation. His own military medics declared him beyond saving and prepared to leave him behind according to their traditional protocols. Ryan and his team refused to accept this decision and worked for 18 hours straight to save the soldier's life. When Vortak woke up in a human medical facility, he found himself surrounded by the same aliens his people had taught him to hate. But instead of enemies, he saw beings who had sacrificed their own rest and resources to keep him alive. The experience shattered everything he had been taught about weakness and strength. Word of the medical miracle spread through the Draknari forces, faster than their commanders could control it. Soldiers began asking questions about why their enemies were healing their wounded instead of killing them. Some Draknari units started requesting transfers to areas where they could work with Alliance construction teams instead of fighting them. General Vorthak faced a crisis of authority as increasing numbers of his own troops began refusing orders to attack Alliance facilities. The concept of compassion was spreading through his military like a disease, and traditional Draknari discipline was powerless to stop it. For the first time in his career, the great general found himself losing a war not because his enemies were stronger, but because they were kinder. The Draknari military campaign began falling apart as more soldiers refused to attack the Compassion Alliance forces. General Vorthak watched his centuries-old command structure crumble as warriors who had been raised for battle started asking to join construction projects instead of destruction missions. The great general had conquered dozens of worlds through fear and superior firepower, but he had no weapons that could fight against kindness. The moment that changed everything came when Dr. Clark's medical team received an emergency call from a Draknari training facility. Vorthak's own nephew, a promising young officer named Kolthak, had been critically injured in an accident involving faulty equipment. The young warrior was dying, and Draknari military medicine could not save him. Vorthak arrived at the human medical facility expecting to retrieve his nephew's body and add another reason to hate the Alliance to his growing list of grievances. Instead, he found Kolthak alive and recovering under the care of the same beings he had spent months trying to destroy. Dr. Clark had worked for 2 days straight to repair damage that Draknari doctors had declared impossible to fix. The general stood in the medical bay surrounded by alien equipment and watched human doctors checking on his nephew with the same care they would show their own family members. Kolthak was awake and talking, something that should have been impossible according to every medical text in the Draknari Military Academy. In a private conversation with Jake, translated by the Universal Communicator, Vorthak struggled to understand human motivations. His massive frame seemed smaller somehow as he asked the question that had been haunting him for weeks. Why would humans heal those who came to kill them? Why would they rebuild what his forces had destroyed? Why would they risk their own lives? To save his people? Jake's response was simple and devastating in its honesty. He told the general that healing was stronger than killing because healing created possibilities while killing only created endings. He explained that humans had learned this lesson through their own bloody history, and they wanted to share that knowledge with the galaxy. The conversation lasted for hours as Vorthak processed concepts that had never existed in his warrior culture. The idea that true strength came from protecting others rather than defeating them was foreign to everything he had been taught. But watching his nephew recover because of alien compassion made the abstract concept suddenly real and personal. News of the general's visit to the medical facility spread through both the Alliance and Coalition forces. Draknari soldiers who had been wavering in their loyalty saw their greatest leader accepting help from their supposed enemies. More importantly, they saw him showing gratitude instead of rage, which violated every principle of traditional Draknari behavior. The Strength Coalition began to fragment as member species questioned whether their military approach was actually working. The warrior clans of Zerion sent secret delegations to Alliance territory to observe the human methods firsthand. Even the predator states began modifying their conquest protocols to include humanitarian considerations. 6 months after the Council had first heard the word compassion, Ambassador Carter returned from her illness to find a completely transformed galaxy. The Compassion Alliance had grown to include 32 species, with new members joining every week. Conflicts that had seemed impossible to resolve were being settled through mediation and mutual aid rather than warfare. The Council chamber itself had been redesigned to reflect the new reality. The old hierarchical seating arrangement, where powerful species sat in front and smaller species were relegated to the back, had been replaced with circular configurations that emphasized equality and cooperation. Every species, regardless of size or age, had equal voice in the new order. Jake found himself addressing the full council not as a junior diplomat from the newest species, but as a leader whose words carried the weight of proven success. He spoke about humanity's greatest discovery, that true strength lay not in the ability to destroy, but in the courage to build, to heal, and to hope. The session was interrupted by a special announcement from General Vorthak himself. The great Draknari warrior stood before the assembled delegates and formally requested that his people be allowed to join the Compassion Alliance. His voice, once used only for battle roars and threats, spoke quietly about learning that honor came from protecting the weak rather than conquering them. The final scene showed the council chamber as species that had been enemies mere months ago worked together on a massive project. They were designing a new type of space station that would serve as a center for interspecies learning and cooperation. The station's blueprints embodied the human principle of compassion, with every species contributing their unique talents, and every species benefiting from the result. As the camera pulled back to show the galaxy itself, the ripple effects of one simple word became visible. Compassion was spreading from world to world, species to species, creating a future that no one could have imagined when the Council first feared the growing influence of one small young species called humanity. Jake's final log entry summed up the transformation perfectly. Today they had learned that the most powerful force in the universe was not gravity or electromagnetism or even the strong nuclear force. It was the decision to care for someone other than yourself. And that decision, once made, changed everything in ways that no weapon or technology ever could.